Saliba, and I am the Federal Policy Director for National Skills Coalition here in Washington. I'm being joined today on the webinar by Angela Hanks, our Senior Federal Policy Analyst. We're very excited to have you all join us today for this webinar. Our goal today is to provide a little bit of an overview of what's going on here in Washington as it relates to workforce development and job training policies. We're going to take you sort of a little bit. We're going to start with a little bit of an overview about the political and the economic context in which we're operating. Then we're going to take a little bit more of a deeper dive into the FY16 budget and appropriations process, which is going on right now here in Washington. And then once we're done with that, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Angela, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of the substantive workforce development policies that are taking place here in Washington, including an update on where things stand with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act implementation, some updates on the SNAP Employment and Training Program, and then some thoughts on some policies that we think might have a chance of moving here in Washington over the course of the next year. We're going to dive right into the policy webinar, but as Yuri said, we are going to be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, you should just go ahead and enter them into the question window, and we will tackle those at the end of the webinar. We'll definitely leave plenty of time to answer any questions that people may have. Okay, so if we can move on to the first slide. So we'd start by just providing a little bit of a sort of a 30,000-foot overview of sort of where things stand at the beginning of 2015 in terms of the political and economic climate. Yeah, so starting with the economic climate, I think the good news here, and it's great news, is that the economy, that we're really seeing that the economy is much improved from where it was, certainly from last year and from where it was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago when we were in the depths of the Great Recession. Right, so we're down to 5.5% unemployment in the most recent month. That's down from 6.7% unemployment just a year ago in February 2014. And it's the lowest unemployment rate that we've seen in this country since May of 2008. So it certainly feels now like the economy, we've moved past the Great Recession. We're starting to see more jobs being added. So 2.95 million jobs added by the economy in 2014. And we're also seeing a change in the budget situation. The federal budget deficit is at its lowest point since the year 2007, so even before the Great Recession. And the improved economic climate is important to kind of keep in mind as we're talking about the policy agenda and the policy landscape here in Washington, because the economy, as folks know, really does have a significant impact on both on the lives of the individuals who we're trying to serve, right? Because the fact that we're adding jobs means that there's more economic opportunity for the American workers. But it's also it's important because it really does help. It really does drive some of the policy conversations here in Washington. So folks probably remember, certainly remember back in 2011, 2012, we were the entire conversation here in Washington was about the budget deficit and about federal spending and how do we cut spending and how do we cut programs that lead to spending. And so the fact that the budget situation has improved here in Washington helps create a little bit of additional political space and a little bit more opportunity where people can take a breath and start to look at new things and start to look at new policies. So if you look at the next slide, the fact that we saw the economy improving and we saw less sort of concern about unemployment and less concern about the budget situation meant that we actually did see some positive developments in 2014. For example, in early 2014, we actually saw Congress pass a new farm bill. The farm bill is important from a workforce development perspective because the farm bill includes the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, formerly known as the Food Stamp Program. It also includes, and as part of that includes what's called the SNAP E&T program, the SNAP Employment and Training Program. We saw not only was the Farm Bill passed and the SNAP E&T program reauthorized, but we actually saw the SNAP E&T there was a modest expansion in SNAP E&T funding and additional funding for pilot programs Angela's going to talk a little bit more about the details of that, but it's important to kind of keep in mind that because the budget situation is improving and because the economic situation is improving, we actually did see some bipartisan movement on the Farm Bill. The other major policy development that we saw in 2014 was of course the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, right? So this replaced the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. This was a law that had been sitting, waiting for reauthorization for more than a decade, and finally you had an opportunity where, despite all the sort of the partisan arguing and backlash of the previous couple of years, we were actually able to move a reauthorization of a major piece of legislation, and actually moved it in a very bipartisan way. So the WIOA actually passed the House with almost unanimously, passed the Senate almost unanimously, and so we saw some. Not only was there an ability to move policy, but there was a real sort of positive energy and bipartisan energy around some key workforce investments and strategies, including new sort of policies around industry and sector partnerships, new policies and around the development and implementation of career pathways, new policy around cross-program alignment and cross-program data. So not just bipartisan agreement around moving workforce policy forward, but also bipartisan agreement on a set of strategies that we have been advocating for as a field for a number of years. We saw those able to move in Congress last year, and of course signed into law by the President. The other sort of major development in 2014 that I think is worth noting is we saw on the same day that the President signed WIOA into law, the administration released the President's job-driven training action plan. This was a major report that where the administration took a look at a range of different federal workforce development programs and investments, looked at key strategies that were and best practices in the field, and came up with their job-driven training action plan, a set of principles that would guide their investments and skills moving forward. And we've really seen that lifted up over the last year or so. You've seen, the administration has been using funding that's available under the H-1B visa program to support a range of different competitive discretionary grants that incorporate a lot of these key principles that were identified in the President's job-driven training action plan. We saw the Ready to Work grants that were focusing on long-term unemployment. We saw the American Apprenticeship grants that were recently announced. There were the Youth Career Connect grants that were announced last year, and then and this is actually, we've seen this this energy from the administration and this recognition of the importance of skills investments has continued to play out. We just saw last month the administration announced new funding for this Tech Hire initiative, where they're working with a number of cities to support the development of tech jobs, and we're expecting to see later this month an additional announcement around upskilling initiatives for frontline workers, developing the skills and the competencies of frontline workers across the country. So 2014, because we had some of this space. I don't want to say that we were in a bipartisan moment, but certainly there was some space for policy development, and I think skills investments, job training programs, workforce development, and education really were sort of a beneficiary of that space and that opportunity to move. But there was, so the question then is whether or not that momentum would carry over into 2015. So if we can go to the next slide. The main thing to kind of think about as we start talking about the political landscape here in Washington now in 2015 is just sort of, there have been some major shifts in the political landscape. So obviously in the 2014 elections, we saw the Republicans were very successful in the 2014 elections. We saw the House, the Republicans retain the House, and they actually increased their majority in the House. They also took over the Senate. So, for the first time in several years, we actually have the same party is in control of both chambers of Congress, both the House and the Senate. That has two sort of impacts on the policy conversation moving forward. Obviously, this means that the Republicans in Congress are in a position to really sort of set the agenda moving forward in both chambers. It also creates the possibility, at least, of greater movement on some legislative priorities because you don't have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate unable to reach agreement. Now you're in a position where, theoretically at least, a Republican House and a Republican Senate should be able to reach agreement on legislative priorities and move those forward, although there is some question at this point whether or not that's actually what's going to happen. The other major shift in the political environment here is that we've started shifting towards the sort of the final 2 years of the Obama administration. The president is no longer up for re-election. His party no longer has control of either chamber of Congress. And so the president, so the administration, while they're still very much engaged in the day-to-day policy conversation, there's a little bit of a shift in thinking now and sort of more thinking about what is the president's legacy, what are sort of the priorities that the president wants to set out as markers moving forward. And so you're going to see this dynamic as we talk through all of these, as we talk through what's going on both on the budget side and the appropriation side, and as we talk about substantive policy. This sort of these dynamics of a new Republican Congress trying to move quickly to establish their priorities, and an administration that is starting to think a little more broadly about what its legacy is going to be. And we definitely see this we've definitely seen this play out in the FY16 budget cycle. So if we can go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the president's FY16 budget request. And for those of you who are not political junkies, let me just explain a little bit about what the budget request is. So every year the president is supposed to submit to Congress a budget request that covers the upcoming fiscal year. The budget request is not binding on Congress in any way, so Congress is free to disregard the president's recommendations on budget. But it is an important document because for two real reasons. One is it allows the president to sort of establish the baseline for the funding conversation, the appropriations conversation, and the budget conversation for each fiscal year. So when Congress actually gets to the appropriations process, they think about their budget numbers and their appropriations numbers in the context of both last year's funding levels, but also in the context of the president's funding recommendations. So it does give the administration an opportunity to sort of set down a marker for what they think should be the funding priorities and where they want to put their investments, or where they think Congress should be putting their investments. The other major thing is it does give the administration an opportunity to help shape the broader conversation about how we think about federal funding and how we think about federal investments. And in the president's FY16 budget request, what you saw was a very strong pivot away from sort of thinking about the conversation around cutting the budget and spending cuts and sequestration and budget caps, and really sort of pushing for this new, broader sort of agenda around investing in the middle class and investing in what they're calling their middle class economics agenda. And a big part of that was a focus on helping Americans upgrade their skills. So what was very exciting about this budget was we saw the president made recommendations for about $80 billion, more than $80 billion in new investments in post-secondary education and skills training. We saw some very significant signaling around key strategies like sector partnerships and career pathways. We also saw, and this was great, an increased emphasis on funding for data quality. So let's dig into a little bit around the specifics of it. So next slide. Okay, so so we said the president in his budget he called for more than $80 billion in new investments in job training and education and other broader investments in skills. Under the Department of Labor, I think that the kind of the top line items, we're not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but I think these are a couple things that are worth noting. So the president requested sort of the centerpiece of the President's proposal around the Department of Labor was this new job-driven training proposal. And this was $21 billion in new investments in 3 major areas. There was $16 billion request for what they're calling high-growth sector training and credentialing. So this would be a set of grants to support the development and implementation of sector partnerships, sector-focused training programs, and developing credentialing partnerships at the state and the local level. It also included additional funding to support job training. So they set a target of doubling the number of people who are actually receiving training services through the one-stop system. This high-growth sector training and credentialing grant would include funding to help support that objective. They included in this job-driven training proposal a $2 billion recommendation for an apprenticeship training fund. So additional resources to help support the development and expansion of apprenticeship programs. And then the third leg of this job-driven training proposal was what they called their Connecting for Opportunity proposal. This would be $3 billion over 4 years to support strategies to help disconnected youth with a particular focus on expanding work-based experiences, whether it's apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeship, on-the-job training, summer jobs, year-round jobs. So very exciting to see the administration calling for a major new investment in a set of strategies that we know are very effective and that would help supplement some of the policies and priorities that were lifted up under WIOA. It's also worth noting that the administration budget called for significant increases for the Wagner-Peiser Employment Service, particularly focused on reemployment and re-engagement services, and then a very substantial increase in funding for the Workforce Data Quality Initiative, which is funding to help support data quality activities at the state level so going from $4 million a year up to $37 million a year. Next slide. The other major bucket of investments, skill investments that we saw in the President's budget were on the Department of Education side. And these, I think, these were proposals I think most people have heard about. So the proposal that got the most, certainly got the most attention in the press was the what was called the America's College Promise proposal. So this was a $60 billion proposal over the next 10 years to provide free community college tuition to any U.S. student that wanted it, qualifying student that wanted it. And this could be used either for an academic degree or for occupational training. There was also a recommendation for $2 million for what was called an American Technical Training Fund. This would be sort of a continuation of the funding that was supported under the Department of Labor under the TAA, the TACT grants, the Community College and Career Training grants under the Department of Labor. So they proposed shifting funding, since that program expired this past year, they proposed including new funding at the Department of Education as part of reauthorization of the Perkins Act, and that would be funding for capacity development at post-secondary institutions to support that activity. And then there was a proposal to increase funding for the State Longitudinal Data System Initiative under the Department of Education, and a proposal to continue funding the state adult education grants at their current level. Now, so this is a very exciting, I mean, I think it's fair to say that this was a very exciting budget from our perspective, because this is far and away the most ambitious skills agenda that we've ever seen in a presidential budget. We need to be clear that the President was proposing this budget in a political environment where the House and the Senate are both controlled by the opposition party, and so there's really no possibility that any of these proposals were going to get taken up by Congress or funded by Congress. But I do think it's important to just acknowledge that that the President did take a stand in support of skills investments and really did try to make an effort to sort of reshape the conversation away from sort of thinking about federal investments totally in terms of budget deficits and cutting spending, and really trying to reshape the conversation in a way as if, to say, if we were really to have a serious skills conversation in this country, this is the kind of conversation, this is the scale of conversation that we need to be having. Whether or not everyone agrees with every one of the proposals or the structure of the proposals, this is the kind of conversation we need to be having. And so National Skills Coalition did weigh in with the House and the Senate Budget Committees, and we did say, to them, we do think that this is, you should at least be thinking about the budget in terms of how we could be supporting these kinds of investments. We had we had an organizational sign-on letter. We got signatures from, I think, over 150 national, state, and local organizations and partners weighing in with the Budget Committee, saying at least you should be considering this, this kind of approach. Okay, so that was the President's budget proposal. Let's now talk about what's happening in Congress. And so both the House and the Senate have now passed budget resolutions. And let's step back a second and we'll talk about what's in a budget resolution and what these are. Congress is supposed to, by law, they're supposed to establish a budget resolution every year by April 15th. Budget resolutions are kind of odd ducks. They're not, a budget resolution is not a law. It doesn't get signed by the President. Essentially, the budget resolution is supposed to be an agreement between the House and the Senate that establishes the overall funding level for the federal government, and then establishes sort of the broad functional investment levels for all of the programs that are supported by the federal government. As I said, it's not legislation. It's not binding. So technically, Congress can go over the budget caps that they establish by resolution. They can also go under the budget caps. Over the past couple of years, we have, even though Congress is supposed to reach a joint budget resolution, we don't often see them because either because the House and the Senate are controlled by different parties and they can't reach agreement on a budget resolution, or as was the case last year, there was already agreements around what the budget caps would be for FY15 because of the bipartisan budget agreement that Congressman Ryan and Senator Murray agreed to back in 2013. But this year, coming into this year, I think it's safe to say that both the House and the Senate were very interested in moving forward towards a joint budget resolution, so both to demonstrate that they could get to a joint budget resolution, but also, as we'll talk about in a second, because budget resolutions, while they're not law, do contain some mechanisms that make certain policy developments more feasible. So let's just talk very briefly about what was in the FY16 budget resolutions. On the House side, the budget resolution was a pretty disappointing resolution from our perspective, particularly in light of all the sort of positive development we've seen over the last couple of years, both in terms of the broader budget conversation, but also in terms, specifically in the context of sort of bipartisan agreement around workforce development and skills investments. So the budget resolution, the House budget resolution, would essentially maintain the discretionary funding caps that were agreed to as part of the Budget Control Act for the current fiscal year. So what that means is the discretionary funded programs like WIOA formula grants under Title I or the adult education grants under Title II, it would essentially maintain the overall funding caps for those discretionary programs. But it does propose balancing the budget over the next 10 years, in part through very substantial cuts in what are called non-discretionary defense programs. That's the NDD you see there on the slide. Again, these are the programs that Congress funds through the appropriations process every year, including key programs like the WIOA core programs and Perkins career and technical education grants. So the House resolution would propose $759 billion in cuts under that over the next 10 years. There was also specific language in the House budget resolution around freezing the Pell Grant maximum award. So currently the Pell Grant has a maximum award level that a student can receive every year to support their that they can use to support their education. I think it's capped at about $5,700 right now. The budget proposal that the House put out, the budget resolution that the House voted on, would essentially freeze the maximum level at its current level for the next 10 years. They also eliminated, they also proposed eliminating some of the mandatory funding for Pell programs, which would make it much harder for Congress to continue to fund the Pell Grant program even at its current level, much less increasing to keep up with the cost of inflation. The House budget resolution included a proposal to grant states greater flexibility around a number of safety net programs, including the SNAP program, and trying to realize savings from that flexibility. So generally speaking, what that means is creating flexibility that would reduce access to those benefits. And then there was, disappointingly, there was some language in the budget report that goes along with the actual reconciliation, where the House essentially said, you know, while we're very pleased with what we were able to accomplish with WIOA, we still think that there is need for additional consolidation and cutting of federal job training programs. And then on the Senate side, the Senate budget resolution was a lot less detailed than the House budget resolution. It did also, though, include, it maintained the discretionary caps for FY 2016, but it included less deep cuts, still cuts, but less deep cuts for over the next 10 years for non-discretionary, non-defense discretionary programs. It also proposed a set of cuts similar to the House budget resolution around Pell Grants and SNAP. The Senate budget resolution did not include language around job training like the House budget resolution did, but there was, when the Senate budget resolution was being debated on the floor last week, there was an amendment from Senator Rob Portman out of Ohio that created what's called a deficit neutral reserve fund that would support savings from any consolidation, any further consolidation of job training programs. Next slide. So this is not great news, obviously. This is not the direction we wanted to see Congress going with the budget resolution. Both the House and the Senate did pass their resolutions. I do want to clarify, just sort of in terms of like the nuts and bolts of how this process works moving forward. So the budget resolution does not set specific funding levels. The budget resolutions don't set specific funding levels for specific programs. They just set the top line levels. And as I mentioned, they maintain the FY16 budget caps, the overall budget caps that were agreed to under the Budget Control Act. So we're not expecting, at least for the discretionary funded programs like Title I WIOA programs and adult education state grants and CTE grants, we're not expecting that there's going to be huge, significant funding changes this year as a result of the budget resolution. I do want to, though, flag that I think that what this does tell us as a field is that there's still a lot of work that we need to be doing as advocates to let Congress know about not only that investments in job training and education are important, but that investments in job training and education are effective and that they're needed by employers and by job seekers alike. So there's clearly a lot of room for us as advocates to continue to build on that message. The other thing I want to just flag about the budget process, and then we'll transition over to Angela's portion of the presentation. I just want to flag that budget. So right now, the House and the Senate have both passed their resolution, their separate budget resolutions. They're now sort of moving to, we're on the Easter recess, and so they're supposed to come back together at the end of the recess and try to come together around a joint budget resolution. There's some question about whether they're going to be able to do so, just because of there's currently some disagreement between the House and the Senate about mostly around defense funding and how we're going to pay for Both chambers are interested in increasing defense funding. They just aren't sure how to do it within the current budget situation. But I do want to flag that there is a process that is allowable under the budget process called reconciliation. Reconciliation is essentially an expedited process where the budget resolution, the joint budget resolution that the House and the Senate agreed to, contains instructions to authorizing committees saying, come back to us at a certain date with a legislative proposal that will, you know, for purposes of this conversation, will lead to budget savings in future years. The House and the Senate are very interested right now in trying to move towards a joint budget resolution and trying to get to the point where they can use reconciliation, particularly around, there's a lot of interest in trying to get to the point where they can get reconciliation instructions around the Affordable Care Act, because there's a very strong interest on the House and the Senate side in trying to move forward legislation that would either repeal or in some cases or in some way replace the Affordable Care Act. Reconciliation is also a tool that can be used for any other sort of policy proposal. And while we don't have any reason to think that job training or education or any of the other sort of policies that were proposed as part of the joint budget resolutions are on the table, there is some possibility that they could be lifted up as part of a joint budget resolution. So we may see something over the next couple of weeks where there is a need for the field to weigh in on a budget reconciliation process, and so we'll certainly let you know, and we'll keep you posted on what happens. Next slide. So as I said, we're moving into the FY16 appropriation cycle. Once the budget resolution gets passed, then we're going to move into the FY16 appropriation. We're going to actually move to the appropriations process. This is where Congress actually makes programmatic spending decisions. Like we said, we're not anticipating that this year there's going to be a whole lot that changes. We're not likely to see major cuts, but we're also certainly not likely to see any major increases in the key program, workforce and education programs. I did want to flag that that right now we're in the process where members of Congress are submitting their appropriations requests to the appropriations committees. So members of Congress are supposed to send letters to the appropriations committees setting their priorities. So we have been working very closely with the House and the Senate on what are called member request letters. So I do want to flag that we were able to get letters on the House side. Congressman Bustos and Congresswoman Duckworth did do a letter on the House side on funding for workforce development programs and the American Technical Training Fund and apprenticeship grants. We also saw Senator Blumenthal did a similar letter on the Senate side. And Angela, I think you can probably fill in. I think we had some other letters that we were working on. So we will probably be coming back to the field at some point to keep you posted on the appropriations process and asking you to weigh in with policymakers moving forward. So, and with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Angela to talk about the policy side.
Great, thanks so much. So yes, so quickly on the appropriations letters, there actually was pretty good support in both the House and the Senate for those letters. In the House, I believe there were 63 members who signed on, and in the Senate it was, I believe, 35 or 36. So certainly you can see that there's strong support for the programs. They were all Democrats, so that's one thing to watch out for going forward in the appropriations process. But certainly these programs do have some friends on the Hill. So as Kermit said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other policy activity that's going on up on the Hill this year and sort of lay out where we think we'll be headed over the next year and some of the priorities that we as NSC have and some of the reauthorizations that will be worked out in Congress over the next several months. So I will talk briefly about the draft regulations for WIOA. As I'm sure everyone knows, they are not out yet, and We have heard that they are coming very soon, should be any day now, but I can give a brief update on that. There are also the SNAP E&T pilots, which Karen mentioned, so we'll discuss those as well. And then some discussion, we'll also have some discussion on the Higher Education Act and the Carl D. Perkins Act on career and tech ed and their prospects for over the next year. So if we can go to the next slide. So the WIOA regulations, as I said, they are not out yet, but they are soon to be out imminently. I think we can expect to see them any day now. It could be as soon as this week, and certainly we're watching out for them closely. And it'll be very important when they come out, both for folks to get a chance to go through them and also to submit comments back to the Departments of Labor and Education. The comments they get are very meaningful and do inform how they finalize the regulations. So certainly, as those become available, it will be critical that you take a look, and if you have feedback to provide them with, that you go ahead and do that during the comment period. So the Departments of Labor and Education have released some information on the way that they will do these notices of proposed rulemaking, which is essentially the draft regulations. So the departments are going to issue 5 notices of proposed rulemaking. So the first one, it will be a joint Department of Labor and Department of Education draft rule for unified and combined state plans, performance accountability, and the one-stop system. The second will cover other DOL administered activities. The third will cover adult education and literacy activities under Title II of the Department of Education. The fourth will cover miscellaneous programs, program changes over at the Department of Ed. And finally, the fifth NPRM will cover state vocational rehabilitation services, also a program governed by the Department of Education. So we have very limited details sort of beyond that, but certainly I think we will be able to have something to share soon enough. The notices of proposed rulemaking not only will have sort of draft language so we can see where the departments are thinking about making changes, but they'll also raise key questions where they're looking for a direct response. So certainly not only will we be able to see what they're thinking, but also there will be an opportunity to give input on specific issues where they're sort of struggling to figure out what the correct way to regulate that issue would be. We have heard that the comment period will be 60 days. So once the regs are released, you can expect that you'll have about 2 months to respond to those. And once they're out, National Skills Coalition plans on posting an initial analysis, and we will also be submitting formal comments that we'll make available so folks can see those as well. Go to the next slide. So as Kermit mentioned, the SNAP Employment and Training Program, that's part of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, was reauthorized last year in January 2014 as part of the Farm Bill. And this was done on a bipartisan basis and included actually a lot of really good changes to the SNAP E&T program. So some of the changes, it restored the 100% funds, which are the funds that are allocated from the federal government to all states, back up to $90 million per year. It created new reporting and monitoring requirements to help monitor and evaluate the program's effectiveness. And finally, it established a new pilot program to test innovative and employment and training strategies to help participants obtain unsubsidized employment, raise earnings, and reduce their reliance on public assistance eventually going forward. So the solicitation for the pilots went out last fall, and the E&T pilot awardees were actually just announced a few days ago on March 20th. So 10 states, you can see here, California, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Kansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Virginia, Vermont, and Washington were all awarded grants under the pilot program. And using these grants, these states will develop new strategies to help SNAP participants build their skills and reduce barriers to work for SNAP participants. So certainly this is an important step in modernizing the program, ensuring that the program is more widely used, particularly the 50/50 funds that are available from the Department of Agriculture. So as as they move forward with the grants, we'll certainly be monitoring how states are using those funds and how those innovative strategies that they're proposing are working to help SNAP recipients. We'll go on to the next one. Congress is also, I would say that probably the two biggest priorities on the Education and Workforce Committee in the House and the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee are the Higher Education Act and the Carl D. Perkins Act. I will talk about the Higher Education Act first, and then we'll talk a little bit about Perkins. But certainly, I think you can say that these are the two biggest priorities behind the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which Congress is working on right now. Certainly, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which includes, which is No Child Left Behind, is sort of this very big and controversial piece of legislation. But I think members of Congress are eager to work on it, but also I think are pretty realistic in the fact that ESEA is a much bigger challenge to reauthorize than the Higher Education Act and the Perkins Act. So if ESEA does not move forward in the way that they're expecting, I think you can see a pretty quick pivot to these other pieces of legislation that are pretty high up on the list. So the Higher Education Act is due for reauthorization beginning in 2013. And so Congress has sort of begun working on this. In the House, they did some work last year. The House Education and Workforce Committee released a white paper outlining priorities for reauthorization. So in that paper, you could see a focus on consolidation of federal loan and grant programs, pushing back on a college rating system, which the framework of which the Obama administration announced back in December for public comment, and also program integrity regulations, including like the gainful employment regulation that covers for-profit educational programs as well as some programs at community colleges. And there's also this greater focus on competency-based models. So in addition to the white paper, the House actually passed 3 bipartisan bills last year, one on counseling, one on a college dashboard, and one on authorizing a competency-based education demonstration project. So certainly, I think we can imagine that competency-based education is a priority for the House going forward. In the Senate, just a few weeks ago, Senator Lamar Alexander, who is the new chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or Health Committee, released 3 papers on the Higher Education Act. And they're currently seeking feedback on some of the proposals that they've included in those papers. So there was a paper on data policy, a paper on risk sharing, and a paper on accreditation reform. So the data policy paper really focused on data collection and streamlining data collection, transparency, consumer-facing data, and protecting student privacy. And our partners, the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, can share more about some of the data proposals during the Q&A portion. The Senate and House are both very interested in moving this forward, but I would say even more so on the Senate side. As I said, Senator Alexander is the new chair of the Health Committee, and for him, he's really said that this is his #1 priority, even above and beyond the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. He's very eager to get this done. And as you heard from Kermit, who, when he was laying out sort of the broader political climate, there certainly is probably an argument that there's a clock on Senator Alexander to get this done because in 2 years we have elections once again, and it's unclear whether he will remain chairman, and he certainly won't if the Senate switches back to Democratic control. So this is a top priority for him and something he would like to move on pretty quickly. And especially, you might also consider that there is very limited time to get this legislation through. Really, most folks think about this year as the window. Sort of going into 2016, Congress and the White House get into election mode, and it becomes difficult to move legislation. So certainly, thinking about HEA and Perkins, this year is really the window where we can see something getting done. So it's likely that if Congress is able to move on this, we'll see comprehensive legislation by the summer. It will depend on what happens with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It also may depend on what happens with the Affordable Care Act. There are scenarios where the committees could be working on making changes to or developing some sort of repeal of the ACA over the summer, which would get in the way of them working on these other pieces of legislation. All right, next slide. So as I mentioned, this is the other top priority for the Education and Workforce and Health committees. This one probably falls third of the three, so it goes ESEA, HEA, and then the Carl Perkins Act. But certainly, just because it's number 3 on the list doesn't mean that there is no political will around it. Perkins in the past has been a largely bipartisan bill, and unlike ESEA and HEA, there's less controversy involved with a reauthorization, so certainly you could imagine a scenario where it's difficult to pass HEA, it's difficult to pass the ACA, and this is a bill where you can get some broad bipartisan support and get something done during this year. So this is something that is important to look at now, even though it's third on the list, and certainly we could see a scenario where this comes up in the near future. So the policy discussion around the Carl D. Perkins Act, which supports the federal share of state CTE grants, really has focused on a couple of things. So it's focused on competitive funding versus formula grants, and certainly you can see the administration released a blueprint for Perkins reauthorization in 2012 that focused on alignment, collaboration, accountability, and innovation. And there were proposals in there around competitive funding for CTE. And then in the most recent budget with the American Technical Training Fund, which the administration has proposed as a CTE innovation fund that is authorized as a part of Perkins reauthorization, there is, again, this sort of interest in figuring out if there is a way to make some portion of the program competitive. So if it's not in the formula grants, this would be something above and beyond the formula grant funding where you could introduce a competitive model to support activities both at community colleges and other providers of training. There's also a focus on this broader adoption of the program of study model, which you can think of as the sequential coursework and articulated pathway in CTE that spans, in some cases, across secondary and post-secondary. And then there's also really broad interest in alignment with WIOA. So certainly now that we have WIOA reauthorization, there are performance measures, there are common definitions, and there are a number of areas where you could see there are clear opportunities for alignment, and there is a lot of interest in figuring out where those opportunities lie and how they can be folded into Perkins reauthorization. So some of the priorities that National Skills Coalition has, both looking at what we have in WIOA and sort of the strategies that we've seen work on the ground. Certainly, there is an opportunity in Perkins to take advantage of these now required sector partnerships under WIOA to think about alignment across programs. Particularly, we have new performance measures under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So that's one other place you might look. And then, of course, career pathways. And certainly, as we're thinking about a broader adoption of the program of study model, how that works with career pathways and how a program of study fits into a broader career pathway strategy. So those are some of the issues that are sort of percolating on CTE. This program has been due to be reauthorized now for almost 3 years. And again, because it's bipartisan and because it's overdue, I think you can expect members to start thinking about this and working on it in the near future. And certainly there are bipartisan on the House side and the Senate side, Democratic and Republican champions for CTE who will continue to advocate for a reauthorization over the course of the next year. We'll go on to the next slide. Okay, and so finally, apprenticeship. So unlike the Higher Education Act or the Carl D. Perkins Act, there is not a major legislative vehicle for apprenticeship. However, there's certainly high interest in apprenticeship in Washington right now, both at the White House, at the agencies, and on the Hill. There are a lot of folks very interested in figuring out how we can expand the apprenticeship model, particularly thinking about how we can expand apprenticeship to non-traditional occupations, so outside of the, in addition to sort of the traditional building trades and somewhat in manufacturing, healthcare, and IT, and how we can increase the number of employers that are using apprenticeship as a strategy to train workers. So this has been a very bipartisan issue. Certainly there are members of the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle who are very interested in figuring out how the federal government can help expand apprenticeship. So on the Senate side, Senator Tim Scott, who's Republican from South Carolina, and Senator Cory Booker, who's Democrat from New Jersey, recently reintroduced the LEAP Act, which they'd previously introduced in the last Congress. And the LEAP Act would provide a tax credit to employers using apprenticeship. And the LEAP Act is very much based on a tax credit that's available in South Carolina that has experienced some success. And so Senator Scott has been very interested not only in apprenticeship broadly, but certainly in this type of activity to help spur employers' use of apprenticeship. So that bill was recently introduced. I think you can expect to see many more apprenticeship bills coming out this year. This is the first, but I doubt it will be the last. A number of other members are very interested in working in this space and very interested in trying to figure out what the federal role is and how they can use the federal government and Congress can use its role to help scale up apprenticeship. So certainly this conversation is going to play out over the next year. And as you heard Kermit say, in the budget, the White House is very interested in this as well. They have this $2 billion apprenticeship fund that they proposed as a part of this job-driven training package, as well as $100 million discretionary grants for apprenticeships. And they also gave out $100 million in grants, American apprenticeship grants, late last year. So this is on their radar. This is on Congress's radar, and certainly I think we can expect some more activity on this going forward. So with that, I think we're going to move into Q&A.
Yeah, hi folks. This is Kermit again, and so we're moving now into the sort of the Q&A session. I know we've covered a lot in the last 55 minutes, and so there's a lot to sort of process there. We want to make sure that we can give everybody an opportunity to type in their questions and ask any questions that they may have. I'm going to start with, we got a question from asking about just sort of some basic clarification about how the House and the Senate budget resolutions can be squared with the authorized appropriations levels that you saw under Section 136 of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So those of you who were, who have read WIOA know that one of the key features was that it authorized specific funding levels for the core programs for through fiscal year 2020. So it's a great question, just and helpful to sort of go through and explain a little bit. So when Congress passes a law, they they can authorize funding levels for each fiscal year, or they can authorize, or they don't have to specify what the funding levels are. But the actual funding for each fiscal year for a given program, so for the, just taking the WIOA Title I formula grants, for example, there's an authorized funding level for FY16, but Congress actually has to appropriate the funding every year through the appropriations process. So what's going on right now is the Congress is working on the budget process, which will establish the top-line funding levels across the federal government. What's going to happen starting in May is that each of the individual appropriations committees on the House and the Senate side are going to start to work on developing the program level funding for each of the programs. So Congress can appropriate up to the authorized level for each of these programs. They can appropriate less than the authorized level if they so choose. So what you're seeing right now is that we're still in the process of waiting to see where Congress will go with the FY16 funding levels. I think it's only fair to note that while in principle Congress is supposed to have their appropriations bills done by the beginning of a fiscal year, so the fiscal year FY16 will start on October 1 of this year. Oftentimes the appropriations process goes past the start of the fiscal year. That's why you get the continuing resolutions or other vehicles where Congress sort of has stopgap funding for programs until such time as they can actually get through the appropriations process. They often don't do separate appropriations bills now. They'll do large omnibus bills that cover all of the different discretionary funding programs. So what you're likely to see over the next couple of months is that the appropriations committees will start to work on their individual appropriations bills for programs heading into FY16, but you may or may not. We probably won't see an appropriations bill until later this fall for FY16. But hopefully that helps to clarify what's happening. Okay, so there's a question here, and I'm going to toss this over to Angela. And this question is, will the 5 notices of proposed rulemaking be released simultaneously? And what will the 5 notices of proposed rulemaking cover? And so, Angela, if you would be willing to sort of go into a little bit more detail about what we expect from the notices of proposed rulemaking.
Sure. So to answer your first question, yes. Second question. So the 5 notices of proposed rulemaking, and unfortunately we don't have a great amount of detail beyond sort of what the headlines of the each NPRM is, but the first one would be a joint rule from the Department of Labor and the Department of Education, and that one is going to cover unified and combined state plans, performance accountability, and the one-stop system. The second is going to cover DOL administered activities, so activities that are only administered by the Department of Labor. The third is from the Department of Education and will cover Title II adult education and literacy activities. The fourth, the best description that we've got is miscellaneous program changes of the Department of Ed, so that will have to wait on the regulations to come out to be able to describe in further detail. And then the fifth is state vocational rehabilitation services programs, and that's also a Department of Ed program. And I should mention, so in addition to these 5 NPRMs that are coming out, the department has said that over the next several months, they will also be releasing operational guidance and will be offering technical assistance. So some of that operational guidance is beginning to come out. Last week, the Department of Labor issued a guidance letter on WIOA youth transition. The WIOA youth program year begins today, so that document sort of details what the plans are for the PY15 funds for the youth program, and they'll continue to issue guidance like that going forward. So if it's not covered in the regs, it may be covered through the guidance or TA. That's possible.
Okay, we had another question about the notices of proposed rulemaking, essentially noting that, so we've heard that the NPRMs are over 1,000 pages, and questioning, whether or not there'll be, whether that's enough time to focus on implementation and response. And I'll just make a quick comment on this question. So we're expecting that the notices of proposed rulemaking, we've heard a lot of different sort of comment or thoughts about what's going to be in the NPRM. I think that it's important to distinguish between a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is what we're going to see coming out of the Departments of Labor and Education sometime in the next couple of weeks, and what we would think of as an interim rule. So the notices of proposed rulemaking that are going to be coming out are going to provide, as Angela said, they're going to provide some indication of what the agencies are thinking in terms of the final regulations. But I also think that what we're going to see is a lot of questions from the agencies where they're really asking for input from states and from local areas about, this is what we're thinking, this is how we're thinking about approaching this issue, this is what we're thinking the rule might be. But they really are, and in conversations that we've been having with the agencies, they've made it clear that they are very interested in hearing from the field about whether or not they're on the right track, whether or not the proposed rules and regulations make sense. They are, WIOA is being implemented. The law does start to take effect on July 1, so certain provisions will start to take effect on July 1. And as Angela said, they are issuing guidance, the departments are issuing guidance to the field around what the regulations, what you should be doing for those provisions that take effect July 1. I think that would expect that in terms of the overall implementation process, we probably won't see out of the NPRMs a fully complete picture of what they're expecting from the regulatory process. They'll be moving. They really are asking us questions, and so this is really a unique opportunity for practitioners and agencies in the field to sort of weigh what's being proposed and to take the opportunity to weigh in with the federal agencies and say, this is what we want to see, this is what we think would work, and this is what we think won't work about what you're thinking moving forward. And as Angela mentioned, we will be weighing in as National Skills Coalition on the NPRMs, and we will also provide. We will seek to provide the field with some basic analysis and outline of what's in the NPRMs when they come. So if you don't want to read all 1,000 pages, you can read our analysis and hopefully get a picture of what's in there. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's see. So hopefully that answered some of those questions. We have a couple of questions here specific to the SNAP Employment and Training Pilot Grant programs. I'm actually, I want to hold off on answering those over as part of the webinar just because we don't have our state policy staff on, and they're the ones who probably are the ones who are best qualified to answer those questions. So we do have a set of questions there that we will try to get, we will definitely follow up on all of these questions that we've received. If we don't answer them here on the webinar, we will definitely follow up with you directly and make sure that you get an answer to your question. Angela, are you seeing any other questions to tackle?
Not at the moment, but if other folks have questions, feel free to send them in now, and we'll try to get them answered in the last couple of minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I think that looks like we've answered, it looks like we've answered most of the questions that we've received. There are a couple of questions where the responses are a little bit more detailed than we can really provide over this webinar. So I think what we will do, unless there are more questions coming in, and we can wait a second to see if there are more coming. But what I'd like to propose is that for all of the questions that we haven't answered here on the webinar, we will respond to everyone directly after the webinar is over. So waiting to see if there are a couple of additional questions. Okay, so okay. So we will. So I think with that, we will go ahead and bring this webinar to a close. And like I said, we do have some questions that are in the queue that we'll probably we'll want to answer offline. But I want to say thanks to everyone for your participation in today's webinar. If you have additional questions or if there's anything that we can answer moving forward, we will be following up with a copy of the webinar presentation deck, and you can also reach out to either Angela or myself by email, and we'll do our best to try to answer. We'll try to answer those questions as soon as we can. And with that, I think we will bring this webinar to a close. Thanks everybody for joining us today.